Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing? How's your podcast coming along? I want to say thank you so much for being here. My name is Chris. I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing that you maybe want to know about that show on and over at that website, which I created by hand all by myself. Check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. There's probably a link to it into the show notes of this episode. But today on Podtastic Audio, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between the two major styles of podcast interviews. And I know maybe you have an interview show, maybe you don't, maybe you have a group show, but eventually it seems like everybody at one point or another, they will have an interview guest on their show at some point. It's just the way it is. And I know some shows really rely heavily on podcast interviews. Like they can't even do a show without having a guest on their podcast. That's basically the meat and potatoes of their podcast is the said guest of the week. Now, if you really want to build your network, then having different guests on the podcast is a way to build that out and branch that out. But if you want to build your personal brand and identity, then solo shows are really the way to go, because when it's just you and a microphone and no other distractions and no other people talking on the same show, just you talking directly to your listener, one-on-one, it's a pipeline from your mouth to their ears, and that's all they get. They get to hear you and your perspectives and your authority on whatever topic you're talking about. It could be anything, whatever it is. It's just you. But today, we're just going to talk about having guests on your podcast and the two, I would say, probably the two different ways to actually do a podcast with a guest for your guest interview type of show. Now, there's lots of different ways to physically record your guest spots for your interview, whether they are in person with multiple microphones, either over Zoom or StreamYard or Google Meet, or even Cleanfeed I like to use, which is audio only. However you decide to do your interview for your show, I'm not talking about that. What I am talking about is actually the two different styles of finished products when it comes to the interview shows. There is the narrative documentary style, which will go into both of these in a little bit, but that one is very complex. And of course, there is also the very common natural conversation style, which I like to do for the most part. Now, on Twitter a little while ago, I put a survey out to see what kind of podcast style do you enjoy listening to? Not which style you like to actually do, but which style do you enjoy listening to? And the results are this. With 81% of the vote, people have chosen they'd rather listen to the natural conversation versus the narrative style. But what's funny is that the narrative style of podcast interviews seems to be more popular with the bigger name, more produced, well-established, big budget style of podcast shows. So today I'm going to go over the different types of shows and what's really the pros and cons for each style. We're talking the conversation style or the narration style of podcasting, and you decide which one is, works best for your podcast and which one would you enjoy listening to. Because at the end of the day, you got to really make a show that you would personally enjoy listening to. And if you don't enjoy listening to your show or a style of show, then please do not do that style. Why do something you hate? I mean, podcasting should be fun. And like I always say, for the record here, you podcast however you want to podcast. You can do it however you want. There's a million different ways to podcast. You find something that you enjoy and that you enjoy listening to, because you're really making the show that you enjoy. So as podcasting has emerged as a popular medium for interviews, offering unique and engaging ways to share knowledge, stories, and insights, when it comes to podcast interview shows, two distinct styles have gained prominence: the natural conversation style and the narration style. While both have merits, they bring different dynamics, and to the listening experience, we will have to go over the pros and cons of each one. Now, starting it off, we're going to start off with the natural conversation style, which I think is probably the easiest way to create a podcast interview. It's probably, I would say, the most popular way to do an interview, especially if you're starting out and you do not have a lot of time, or let's just say you don't have a big budget to sit down there and really fine tune and tweak every single thing. You basically hit record on whatever platform you use. You might, take out a few ums and maybe add an intro music of some sort, or an intro, or even intro the interview itself. Like today we have so-and-so on the show. Here's my conversation with so-and-so. Here they are. And you kind of play it very natural. Now, the nice thing about the natural conversation is that it really flows fairly well, just like you're having a natural conversation. The natural conversation style aims to stimulate the organic and spontaneous discussion between host and the guest. It prioritizes authenticity and relaxed atmosphere, which is always a great thing, and a free-flowing exchange of ideas. Now, here are the pros and cons of that style. See, the pros are this. Of course, authenticity. Natural conversation allows for genuine reactions and emotions and unscripted moments that make the interview feel more personal and relatable. Now, also it has engaging, and it's very dynamic. The conversation approach creates a sense of energy and back and forth banter, which everyone loves, keeping the listener engaged and entertained. If you can educate and entertain at the same time, and most importantly, keep the listener engaged into the interview, it's a great thing. Now, here are the cons to having the natural conversation style. Here's the first one I got here is lack of structure. Yeah, see, the absence of a rigid script can sometimes lead to different things going off topic, kind of going off the rails a little bit. You'll have a guest talking about all kinds of different things, or maybe you'll jump in a conversation and say, oh, remember the time we did this? Or remember this thing? Oh, hey, I did this one thing this one time, and they kind of go on a tangent. That can happen sometimes too. Now, because of that, what can also happen is one of the cons, it can have lengthy episodes. You see, a natural conversation, if you do not have any kind of clock that you're watching or a hard stop at a certain time, these podcast interviews can really go on for hours. Some people can do that. I like to have a clock and I'm always watching it. See, I always give our guests a 1 hour window to do the interview. And usually it's, way earlier than that, but that's kind of like the idea. We'll say hard stop at this time. That way it gives everybody an idea of when we're going to start wrapping this thing up. I'm always watching the clock for that thing. I can see where you can actually start talking and just go rambling on forever and ever, especially with a guest that you really are very comfortable with. It could be a friend or something like that. So it also has the potential for information overload. Without a tightly organized structure, essential points can get buried or lost with the conversation, making it a challenge for listeners to extract key takeaways. Now let's discuss the narration style, or I like to call it the documentary style. If you watch any documentary and they do this whole interview thread throughout the entire documentary, you'll have the one major host telling the story or talking about the topic, and then you'll have interviews from people. And of course, the host, you never hear them ask the question, but you'll see the person being interviewed answer the question or talk about whatever it is they're talking about. You see, the narration style takes a more structured and controlled approach, with the host providing narration context and guiding the interviewees through the predetermined script. Here's the thing, script. Here are some of the pros and cons of that style. Pros. Number one, clarity and focus. The narration style ensures a clear direction, allowing the host to cover specific points and ensure the interview remains on track. Number two, conciseness. The structured format allows for a concise delivery of information, making episodes more time efficient for busy listeners. Yeah, because a lot of people do not have time for you to ramble on for an hour before you get your one little point across. And the number three pro for narration style is enhanced storytelling. By incorporating well-crafted narratives and transitions, the narration style can create a compelling and immersive story experience. I'm talking sound effects and just kind of like the way they do it in the documentary. So here are the cons of doing a narration style, other than the obvious of it takes you a ton of time to put one of those together. You're going to have reduced spontaneity. The more controlled nature of a narration style may limit the natural flow of conversation, potentially sacrificing the organic feel of a normal conversation. Number 2 we got here is less flexibility. You see, the rigid structure may leave little room for unexpected insights or unplanned detours, which can be a good thing because sometimes your guest will just drop some gold that was totally unplanned or especially unscripted. And the third con for creating a narration style podcast is the potential for a very sterile and boring episode. You see, overall scripted episodes can sometimes lack the warmth and personal connection that comes with a genuine, unfiltered conversation. You see, both styles of podcast interviews, they're good for some people. Some people like one way, some people like another way. It's up to you what you have time for and what you enjoy listening to decide on what kind of podcast style works best for you. Now that you kind of understand the differences, the pros and cons between each style of podcast interview, how would one go about creating, let's just say, a narration style of podcast interview? How would you make one, and what does it take to do that? Well, basically what you do is you record your podcast interview exactly like you would any other interview, but it's probably a little more scripted. You probably have an outline written down. Questions may have been sent out to the guest in advance. You definitely have questions written down, and you do not go off of those scripted questions. But if you do, it's okay. It's no big deal. You have your interview like you would any other interview. You take the guest side audio, not your audio. In fact, your audio, you just throw it away. You don't even need your side of the conversation. What? Yeah, trust me, this is how you got to do it. So you basically will scrub through the finished podcast interview after you make them sound great and your guest sounds great. Everything looks great, sounds great. You find the things they said that are really key moments to the overall structure of the podcast interview. Whatever the theme is to that episode that day, you find their key takeaways. And they should be pretty easy to find if you pretty much stuck to the script when it came to interviewing your guest. So you find their answers, the key takeaways of their answers. And basically what you got to do is you got to slice and dice and really have to find those exact spots. And what you're going to do is when you physically are putting the episode together, this is where it gets a little tricky because you have to physically ask the question again, but you don't have to always say it in a question. You always can say something like, oh, my guest was so-and-so today who was a astronaut and a president, and the list goes on. And we were talking about the new rocket ship that's going to go to Mars and the new rocket fuel that needs to be made to make it happen. And here are their thoughts on the rocket fuel. And you basically insert the part where they're talking about that rocket fuel in, the podcast episode when you're piecing it all together. Basically what you're doing is you're saying something and you're piecing in what the guest said that reflects what you said. It's not quite the same thing as a Q&A, although it could be. But if you set it up just right, it'll sound as if you're telling a overarching story throughout the podcast, and your guest is basically reinforcing the things that you're saying. Now, I know it sounds like a lot of work, and it probably is. I have never done an episode like this, nor do I want to. I think it really needs a team of people making a podcast like this because all the work you got to do and all the editing you got to do and finding the right key spots and cutting them out. Actually, I think about this. Any interview that you do, even ones in your back catalog, you can take apart and make like a documentary narrative style podcast episode out of any interview you've already done. It's probably best, though, if the guest has really good audio, but it's not necessary. You don't have to have that, but it always helps if everybody has good audio, to tell you the truth. Now, to be honest with you, there's a few different podcasts that I listen to that actually do this style of podcast interviews, and they're big budget shows with a big staff and a big crew, and they are, they're up there in the, the rankings pretty high up. And for some reason, when I listen to their interviews, I get kind of like turned off by them. Like, what? I know they're doing it because they want to save time, get straight to the point and all that stuff and keep the flow going. But for me, maybe it's all the years of listening to regular radio. Maybe it's all the years of doing regular podcast interviews or having normal interviews that when you splice and dice a podcast interview up in 10 different ways and you play it back, it sounds a little disjointed. When I hear it, I'm like, okay, I get it, but it almost feels as if I'm disconnected from the conversation they're having. Like, I don't feel like they're even having a conversation. I feel like it's basically like he's just reading a question and answer sheet that you wrote the question and the guest wrote the answer, and you're just kind of going back and forth reading them verbatim. There's no actual conversation. There's no dialect. There's no laughing. There's no moments of that. You can still do that stuff with a narration show. You can kind of put them both together. I've seen that too, where you have a little bit of combination of both. But at the end of the day, really, it's up to you which style of podcast interview you want to do, or even if you want to even do a podcast interview. I would suggest, if you're doing a podcast, you having interviews, I would suggest maybe throwing in some solo shows every once in a while. Don't rely heavily on the guest. There's no written rule or understanding that the guest has to do anything other than show up and produce an amazing interview on their side of the conversation. You like to hope that maybe your guest comes in with a decent gear and decent equipment, but it doesn't always happen that way. And also, you would like the guest to share the episode, but it doesn't always happen that way. You see, there's only one person you really can count on every week, and that is yourself. So if you do a solo show every once in a while, that will produce a great show where you can control the content and say whatever it is you want and boost your authority in your topic, in your field of expertise. Don't worry about a guest. Don't wait on a guest. Don't rely on what they're going to say. And you never know. Not all guests are great. We've had some bad guests come through, or guests that were very boring. And at the end of the day, whether you decide to do a narration style podcast interview or you decide to make it more natural, more fun, more of an organic conversation, like you're live sitting around the table hanging out in the same room, which personally I prefer that be over the narration style. But, it's just me. But however you decide to do it, have fun, enjoy it, do whatever works best for you and your style, or mix and match. You said there's podcasting, you can do anything you want. There's no rules. There's no right way. There's no wrong way. Do it however you want. If it's bad and you create a boring show and it's a boring interview, your numbers are probably going to reflect that. And people usually will vote with their ears. And if they decide they don't want to listen to your show, then they just won't listen to your show. So to wrap this up, the differences between the narration style of podcast interview and the natural conversation style of podcast interview basically goes down to how much time do you have for editing? What kind of style do you want to have on your podcast? And do you want it to be very natural or very scripted? The natural sounds natural, and the scripted definitely sounds very scripted. Let me tell you, it sounds like someone's reading a script back and forth. And however you want to do it, it's really up to you, whether you have time for one or the other, or you like listening to one or the other. It's really your show. You have fun, and you create an amazing podcast that you enjoy listening to. Hey, thank you once again for listening. And if you found any value from listening to this podcast today, maybe you learned something new or something that could benefit your podcast, please share this episode with a friend. Every single podcast player has an app that has a sharing feature built right into it. Just click the little tab and share it with all of your friends that possibly could need to use this information to create a better podcast for them. And I will see you on the next episode.